Her small beggar girl saw a millionaire and shouted, "Daddy, I found you." When the millionaire saw the girl's birthmark, he fainted. The night fell heavy on the streets of the humble neighborhood, where simple houses huddled between dimly lit alleys. Puddles had already formed on the uneven sidewalks, reflecting the few lights that still worked on the rusted lampposts. "How good God is to me," Hazel murmured to herself, looking at the bread in her wrinkled hands. "At least today I'll have something to eat before sleeping, and there's even a little bit left for tomorrow." Hazel, a lady with completely white hair and a face marked by deep wrinkles, walked with difficulty after a long day hunched over her sewing machine. Her steps were slow and painful, supported by a worn cane that knew every hole on that path. Her hands, deformed by arthritis, carried a plastic bag with the leftover bread she had managed to get from the bakery. Her worn dress, made by herself, was damp from the light drizzle that had started to fall. "My back can't take this heavy work anymore," she thought to herself, stopping to rest. "But as long as God gives me strength, I will keep fighting." A weak, broken crying cut through the silence of the night. The sound was so painful that it seemed to come from the soul of whoever was suffering, almost muffled by the thickening rain. Hazel stopped, adjusting her old framed glasses with scratched lenses on her nose. Her tired eyes searched the darkness for the origin of that wail that broke her heart. "My Jesus Christ, what suffering is that I hear?" she whispered, her heart beating faster. "It sounds like a little creature dying in pain." The alley where she found the girl was a narrow, dark corridor between two abandoned buildings. The ground was covered in trash and dirty water draining from the rusted gutters. Among soaked cardboard boxes and old newspapers, a small figure trembled violently. The child didn't appear to be more than 6 years old, her frail body shaken by shivers of cold and fever. "Lord my God, how can there be such cruel people?" Hazel murmured, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she saw the girl's condition. Abandoning a little child like this, in this weather. The little one's state was heartbreaking. Her dress, which must have once been white, was stained with mud and dirt. Her bare feet had deep cuts and scratches, some still bleeding. The angelic face was marked by purplish bruises, as if she had been hurt. In her cold, dirty little hands, she clutched an antique-looking expensive watch, her only treasure. "Calm down, my little angel from heaven, I'll take care of you," Hazel spoke softly, noticing how the girl shrank back in fear. "No one will hurt you anymore, I promise." The rain now fell in cascades, turning the streets into small rivers. The girl trembled even more, her skin too warm despite the cold betraying a high fever. Her cracked, bluish lips tried to form words, but only incomprehensible sounds came out of her mouth. Her ribs showed through the thin fabric of her dress, revealing days, perhaps days of hunger. "Our Lady, this child is burning with fever," Hazel whispered, touching the little one's forehead with her calloused hands. "I need to get her out of here before she catches pneumonia." With an effort that made her aching back protest, Hazel took off her only wool coat and wrapped the girl in it. The thick fabric, even damp, was better than the soaked dress the little one wore. The child didn't resist the gentle touch, perhaps too weak to fight, or perhaps instinctively recognizing the maternal love in those wrinkled hands. "Come with Grandma, my little rosebud," she murmured sweetly, carefully picking up the girl in her arms. "Let's go somewhere warm and safe." The way home never seemed so long. Each step was a battle against the heavy rain and the weight in her arms. The girl, who should have weighed like a normal 6-year-old, was frighteningly light. Her breathing came in pained gasps, and her body alternated between violent shivers and a worrying stillness. "Just a little more, my angel," Hazel whispered, ignoring her own pains. "Soon you'll be warm and safe." Hazel's house was small and simple, but clean and tidy. The walls, even with the peeling paint, conveyed the warmth of a home. With difficulty, she carried the girl to the bathroom, where an old, chipped bathtub awaited. As the warm water filled the tub, she gently tried to loosen the watch from the child's hands. "You can keep your little treasure, no one will take it from you," she promised, seeing the panic in the little one's eyes. "We're just going to take a bath to chase away this cold." During the bath, each new discovery broke the old lady's heart a little more. The frail body was covered in bruises at different stages of healing. On her back, reddish marks suggested recent burns. The heart-shaped birthmark on her neck stood out on her pale skin, the only beauty amidst so much suffering. Who could have done such cruelty? Hazel thought, silent tears streaming down her face as she carefully cleaned the wounds. Such a small child and already carrying so many scars. After dressing the girl in an old nightgown of hers, which looked more like a dress due to its size, Hazel prepared a thin soup with the few ingredients she had. Her heart ached to see how slowly the little one ate, as if afraid the food would be taken away from her at any moment. The watch remained firmly in one hand, while the other brought the trembling spoon to her mouth. "There's more, my dear, you can eat without fear," she said affectionately, caressing the child's still damp hair. "From now on, you'll never go hungry again." The night advanced, and the rain continued to fall mercilessly outside. On the only bed in the house, the girl finally slept, still burning with fever. Hazel watched over her sleep, changing the cold compresses on her forehead and praying softly for that life that fate had placed in her arms. Hazel's heart missed a beat when she carefully examined the clock and saw the Carden family name engraved on the watch. She knew the Millionaire family in the city. She remembered seeing a report about them, but a child in the family was never mentioned. Her eyes turned to the mark on the sleeping child's neck, identical to the mark that was recognized by everyone in the city. The coincidence was too great to be ignored. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak, watching the hurt little face that now, in sleep, finally seemed at peace. "Holy Virgin," she whispered, making the sign of the cross, "I won't let you go back to this place where they hurt you. You're safe here. I'll do whatever it takes so that no one who can hurt you finds you and hurts you again," the elderly woman promised. 2 years had passed since that rainy night. Rose, now 8 years old, had become a sweet and attentive girl. Her eyes, once marked by fear, now shone with love when caring for Hazel. On that Sunday morning, as she always did, she woke up early to prepare breakfast for her heart's mother. Her little hands already knew the way to the kitchen, and with skill acquired through daily practice, she lit the old stove to heat the milk. "Grandma Hazel needs to eat properly," she murmured to herself as she set the simple table. "She's been so tired, so different." Years had taught Rose to be observant. She noticed how Hazel's hands trembled more while sewing, how her breathing became labored after small efforts, how sometimes she stopped in the middle of a sentence, lost in distant thoughts. The girl set on the table the bread she had bought the previous afternoon with the money she had saved by doing small jobs for the neighbors. "Grandma needs to eat before taking her medicine," Rose thought, organizing the pills by time as the pharmacist had taught. "I can't let her neglect her health." The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the small house when Hazel finally appeared in the kitchen. Her face was paler than normal, and her hands clutched her chest discreetly. Rose ran to help her sit down, noticing how her skin was cold and damp with sweat. The antique watch, which she never took off her neck, hung from a worn chain. "My little angel, you didn't have to bother," said Hazel in a weak voice, trying to smile. "You set everything up, my little one. You didn't have to." As she served the coffee, Rose realized that something was different. Hazel barely touched the food. Her eyes seemed distant, lost somewhere in the past. Suddenly, the elderly woman grabbed the girl's arm with surprising strength, her wide eyes fixed on the birthmark that the little dress didn't cover. "My little one, I'm not feeling well. I'm holding on for you. But I don't know how long I can take it. I need you to know about that night. The night I brought you home." "I should have told you before," Hazel murmured, her voice going in and out of focus. "Your father, my little one, I need you to know who he is." Rose's heart raced when she heard those words. In 2 years, Hazel had never mentioned knowing something about her origin. The girl held the elderly woman's trembling hands, feeling how cold they were. Sweat now trickled down her wrinkled forehead, and her breathing became increasingly difficult. "Grandma, stop that. You're scaring me. You can't get sick. I need you," Rose pleaded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "My family is you." Hazel tried to speak, her lips moving without making a sound. Her skin took on a frightening grayish hue, and her hands clutched her chest more tightly. The elderly woman's eyes widened in panic as she tried to articulate words that wouldn't come. "The watch. Your father's name is the same as Ma," Hazel babbled before her voice was cut off by a moan of pain. "Ma." In a matter of seconds, everything changed. Hazel slipped from the chair, falling into Rose's arms as she desperately tried to hold her. The elderly woman's body convulsed violently, while strangled sounds escaped from her throat. The coffee cup fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. "No, Grandma, please don't leave me," Rose screamed, trying to keep Hazel's head off the ground. "I need you." With her heart pounding out of control, Rose tried to remember what to do in an emergency. Hazel had always said to call for help if something happened. But how could she leave her there, alone? The girl's hands trembled as she tried to find the old woman's pulse, as she had learned at school. "Hold on, Grandma," she whispered between sobs, caressing the already colorless face. "I'll go get help. I promise I'll be right back." Hazel's body was getting heavier, her breathing weaker. Rose knew she had to act fast. Carefully, she placed a pillow under the old woman's head and ran to the door. Her legs were trembling so much she could barely stand. "Please, God, don't take my Grandma," she prayed as she ran, tears blurring her vision. "She's all I have in the world." The morning sun blinded her eyes as she ran down the street, her bare feet hitting the hot asphalt. Her simple dress fluttered in the wind, revealing the mark on her neck, the same mark Hazel always asked her to hide. "Help! Someone help me!" Her voice echoed through the still deserted Sunday streets. "My Grandma is feeling sick." The houses all seemed closed, the windows blind to her desperate cries. Rose ran back and forth, banging on gates, shouting until her throat hurt. Time seemed to drag as she searched for help, each second an eternity away from Hazel. "Please, anyone at all," her now hoarse voice begged. "She's going to die. My Grandma is going to die." The panic grew in her chest as the minutes ticked by with no response. Her legs were starting to give out, her lungs burning for air, but she couldn't stop. Hazel's pale face wouldn't leave her mind, along with the incomplete words about her father. "Help!" she screamed one last time, her voice breaking in despair. "Someone please help me." With a burning throat and battered feet, Rose ran back home. Her sobs echoed through the empty street as her small hands trembled to open the door. Hazel was still in the same spot, her breathing growing fainter. The girl ran to the old phone on the kitchen wall, the one the old woman had always said to use only in emergencies. Her fingers dialed the number she had memorized from hearing Hazel repeat it so often. "Please answer quickly," she whispered between tears, clutching the phone. "Grandma is getting colder," she pleaded to herself as she called for an ambulance. The minutes waiting for the ambulance felt like an eternity. Rose knelt by Hazel's side, holding her cold hand as she watched the old woman's chest rise and fall in ever weaker movements. The antique watch, still hanging around Hazel's neck, glistened in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "Hold on a little longer, Grandma," Rose begged, her tears falling on the pale face. "Help is coming, I promise." The sound of the siren cut through the Sunday morning silence, bringing a mix of relief and terror to Rose's heart. Within seconds, the small kitchen was invaded by people in white, their voices technical and urgent, filling the room. Rose was gently pushed aside, but her eyes never left Hazel's face for a second. "BP is very low," one of them said, moving quickly. "We need to stabilize before transport." At the hospital, the corridors seemed endless. Rose ran alongside the gurney, her short legs struggling to keep up with the doctor's hurried pace. Hazel had briefly regained consciousness in the ambulance, her eyes desperately searching for something or someone. "My little one," she called weakly as she was wheeled through the bright white halls. "I need to tell you about the watch." The doctors stopped in front of a set of double doors, and a nurse held Rose back by the shoulders, keeping her from following. But Hazel, with one last effort, grabbed the girl's hand. Her eyes, though clouded, conveyed a frightening urgency. "It's from your family, my angel," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Guard it with your life. It will lead you to your father. His name." Hazel's words were cut off by a shrill beeping from the machines. Her eyes closed, and her hand slipped from Rose's. The doctors began shouting orders, pushing the gurney through the double doors, leaving the frightened girl behind, alone in the cold hallway. "Grandma, you didn't finish telling me," Rose screamed, pounding on the closed doors. "Please let me in, she needs to finish." The following hours were a blur of waiting and fear. Rose curled up in a hard chair in the waiting room, her small fingers clutching the watch now hanging from her own neck. Hazel had insisted she take it before they got in the ambulance. Every time the double doors opened, her heart leapt. "Why did she say the watch is from my family?" she thought, staring at the antique object. What else did she want to tell me? The sun was already setting when a doctor finally approached. His tired face and the way he avoided looking directly at Rose said it all. The girl stood up, her legs shaking, as she heard the life-changing words. "She's in a deep coma," the doctor gently explained. "We've done everything we can, but now all we can do is wait." Rose was authorized to see Hazel for a few minutes. The room was silent, except for the constant beep of the machines. The elderly woman looked so small and frail in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connected to her motionless body. "Wake up, Grandma," Rose whispered, holding the inert hand. "You need to tell me the rest of the story." The days turned into an anguishing routine. Rose refused to leave the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable room chair. The nurses moved, brought food and blankets, while she kept vigil over her only family's forced sleep. "There has to be a way for Grandma to get better soon," she murmured to herself, playing with the watch around her neck. "No matter what she says about my family, I can't live without her." A week passed with no change. Rose watched the doctors make their rounds, understanding more and more the worried expressions on their faces. On the night of the 7th day, she overheard a conversation she shouldn't have. Two doctors discussing Hazel's case outside the room. "The chances of recovery are minimal," one of them said in a low voice. "Her health has deteriorated too much." Rose's world collapsed with those words. Sitting by the bed, she clutched the watch tightly, as if it could contain all the answers she needed. Hazel's incomplete words echoed in her mind, along with the terrible possibility of never knowing their full meaning. "What did you want to tell me so badly?" she thought, silent tears streaming down her face. "Why is this watch so important?" The cruel reality hit Rose like a slap when she returned to the empty little apartment. The deafening silence and the absence of the smell of coffee that Hazel always made in the morning made her heart ache. With trembling hands, she began to look for coins in the places she knew, inside the old sugar pot, under the thin mattress, in the drawers of the worn dresser. Each penny found was a small victory, but also a painful reminder that she was now completely alone. "If you were here, Grandma, you would know exactly what to do," she whispered into the emptiness of the room, her tears falling on the watch that still hung around her neck. "But I promise I'll be strong. I'll manage on my own until you wake up." The streets of downtown were a labyrinth of indifference. Rose, with her small box of candy, bought with the found coins, tried to catch the attention of the hurried pedestrians. Her feet, protected only by old slippers, ached from so much walking. The relentless midday sun made her stomach rumble even more, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything since the day before. "Please, sir, buy a candy." "They're only a few coins and they're really tasty," she pleaded with a trembling voice, as a businessman rushed past. "I really need to sell them all today. I have nothing else to eat at home." The delicious smell wafting from the Italian restaurant made her stomach churn. Rose watched through the window as people savored their dishes, chatting and laughing, oblivious to her hunger. Mustering courage, she pushed the heavy door and approached the counter, where a man in a white apron looked at her with suspicion. "Sir, excuse me for disturbing you, but would you perhaps have a little stale bread?" "It's been 2 days since I've had anything to eat," her voice faltered. "I can clean the tables or wash the dishes in exchange. I'll do anything." The answer came brutal and unexpected. A bulky employee emerged from the back of the kitchen carrying a bucket, his face twisted in an expression of disdain. "Get out of here, you dirty girl! I told you I don't want beggars at the door of my restaurant," he shouted, throwing a jet of icy water directly at Rose's face. The razor-sharp liquid soaked her already tattered clothes, making her choke and tremble violently. The customers, who had previously pretended not to see her, now openly laughed at her misfortune. An elegant lady pointed at her wet clothes, commenting aloud, "This is the only way to scare these people away. Only then will they learn." Rose felt her face burn with shame as tears mixed with the water streaming down her face. "I just wanted a piece of old bread," she whispered to herself, her voice choked by crying and hunger as she ran out of the establishment. "If Grandma was here, she would never let them treat me like this. Why are people so mean?" she asked, trying to understand what happened. "Grandma always said there is kindness in the world, but I'm starting to doubt it." Night fell, bringing a biting cold. Rose huddled under the awning of a closed shop, using old newspapers as a blanket. Her still damp clothes clung to her body, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The wind whistled between the buildings, bringing with it the smell of rain. This watch must be worth something, she thought, looking at the object that was her only link to an unknown past. But I can't sell it, it's the only clue I have about who I really am. The wee hours crept by slowly, and Rose watched the few visible stars between the skyscrapers. Her body ached from cold and hunger, but something deeper was beginning to trouble her. A dry cough surfaced, making her chest burn with every breath she tried to take. "I'll hold on, Grandma," she murmured to herself, clutching the watch tightly. "You always said that after the storm comes the rainbow." The cough worsened by the minute, turning into violent fits that shook her entire body. The metallic taste in her mouth frightened her, and when she looked at her hands, she saw dark red stains. Panic began to take over her small body. "I can't get sick now," she thought desperately, feeling another coughing fit approaching. "Who will take care of me if I get worse?" The sound of her own moans echoed in the empty street as her hands trembled more. Her vision was starting to blur, and a deep weariness was taking over her body. The watch around her neck seemed to weigh a ton. "Help," she whispered weakly, but her voice barely came out. "Someone, please help me." The first rays of dawn were beginning to tint the sky pink when Rose felt her strength fading. The cough now came accompanied by sharp pains in her chest, and red was already staining her shirt. The world around her was starting to spin. "Will you and I go to heaven, Grandma?" she asked the wind, feeling her eyelids heavy. "Or will I finally find out who my father is?" One last violent cough shook her frail body, and more red liquid dripped from her pale lips. The watch shone in the faint light of dawn, as if holding all the secrets she would never get to uncover. Her stained hands still clung tightly to the object. "Please, I don't want to die without knowing the truth," were her last words before the darkness began to take over. "Dad, where are you?" The world around her was beginning to disappear into a dark mist. The last thing Rose saw was the watch glowing around her neck, holding all the mysteries of her origin. Then, everything went dark. The world around her was beginning to disappear into a dark mist. The last thing Rose saw was the watch glowing around her neck. "Grandma, I can't leave now. I still need to go back to the hospital. You can't be left alone," she whispered with her last strength, before the darkness enveloped her completely, her frail body shaking with another violent coughing fit. The sun scorched the dusty city streets as Rose tried to get up from the sidewalk where she had spent the night. Her small body burned with fever, and every movement was as if thousands of needles pierced her muscles. The world spun in a whirlwind of confused colors and sounds as she leaned against the walls of buildings to try to remain standing. Her wobbly legs could barely support her weight, and sweat poured down her pale face, soaking her already dirty clothes even more. "Please, ma'am, how do I get to San Rafael Hospital?" she asked a well-dressed woman passing by. The woman looked at Rose with disdain, clutching her purse to her body and quickening her pace. "Get away from me, I have nothing to give you," she snapped, already walking away. The path seemed endless under the scorching sun. Rose staggered, leaning on poles and walls, stopping every few steps to try to regain her balance. Her vision was becoming more and more blurred, and the heat radiating from her body contrasted with the chills that made her tremble. People moved away when they saw her, some covering their noses, others crossing the street to avoid passing close by. "Sir, is the hospital still far away?" she asked a fruit vendor, her voice trembling with the effort. The man pointed to a large white building a few blocks ahead, without taking his eyes off his wares. "That's the big building over there, but if you don't have money, don't even bother." "They don't treat people without payment," he replied, judging the simple, tattered clothes the girl wore due to the time she had spent in the hospital. Each step towards the hospital seemed to drain more of her strength. The world began to blur at the edges, as if she were looking through a fogged-up glass. Rose needed to stop at every corner, her small body shaking with the effort of staying upright. A lady sweeping the sidewalk watched her from afar, but made no move to help when the girl nearly fell while trying to cross the street. "Just a little more," she whispered to herself, clutching the watch to her chest. "I need to hold on to reach the hospital and then go back soon to see my grandma." The hospital lobby was spacious and cold, a brutal contrast to the heat radiating from her body. Rose dragged herself to the reception desk, her legs trembling so much that she needed to lean against the wall a few times before reaching it. The strong smell of disinfectant made her head spin even more, and the fluorescent lights seemed to pierce her eyes. "Please, I really need to see a doctor," she pleaded to the receptionist who typed incessantly. The woman briefly raised her eyes, examining Rose with evident distaste. "It's $500 for a consultation plus the exams, and I need to see your documents and proof of payment before anything else," she spoke coldly. Rose felt tears streaming down her feverish face. The world was spinning faster and faster, and she had to cling to the edge of the counter to keep from falling. The people in the waiting room watched her, with a mixture of discomfort and impatience, some whispering among themselves. "I don't have money or health insurance, but I'm very sick," she whispered, her voice faltering. "Please help me." "I can pay later." The receptionist laughed humorlessly, pointing to a sign on the wall. "You see that? No service without prior payment. There are several community hospitals in town. This is a private one." A doctor rushed down the hallway, and Rose mustered her last strength to call out to him. Her body was trembling violently now, and cold sweat ran down her pale face. The ceiling lights seemed to dance in her vision, forming strange halos that made her even dizzier. "Doctor, please. I'm very sick. I don't know if I'll make it to the community hospital." Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The doctor paused briefly, looking at her over his glasses. "Speak to the reception. Without payment, I can't do anything," he replied curtly, continuing on his way. Rose's head felt like lead, and her knees threatened to give way at any moment. She staggered to one of the waiting room chairs, her small body shaking with the effort. The people around her discreetly moved away, leaving several empty chairs around her. "Grandma, forgive me," she thought to herself, feeling hot tears rolling down her face. "I can't hold on anymore." A security guard approached with firm steps, his expression making clear his intention to remove her. Rose tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world began to spin faster, and a strange buzzing filled her ears. "If you're not going to see a doctor, you need to leave," the man said, his voice sounding distant to Rose's ears. The voices around her began to blend into confused noise. Rose tried to focus her vision, but the images became more and more blurred. Her hands, which had been holding the watch so tightly, began to tremble uncontrollably. "Just one moment," she tried to say, but the words died in her throat. Her small, feverish body finally succumbed to exhaustion. The world seemed to slow down as she felt her body slip from the chair. The watch, which she had held so carefully, slipped from her trembling hands. "The girl is a..." someone began to say, but Rose could no longer hear the rest. The metallic sound of the watch hitting the marble floor echoed through the lobby. The precious object spun several times, its soft tinkling contrasting with the sudden silence that fell over the room. As it rolled away from Rose's unconscious body, it carried with it all the secrets of its origin. In the silence that overtook the hospital lobby, Rose's small, feverish body finally met the cold floor. Her dark hair spread like a fan around her pale, sweaty face, while her now empty hands without the watch lay limp at her sides. The world around her continued its normal course, people coming and going, phones ringing, voices conversing, as if an unconscious child on the floor was just another insignificant detail on yet another ordinary day at that hospital. Daphne Carden crossed the hospital lobby with uncertain steps, one hand leaning against the wall and the other on her pregnant belly. Her blood pressure was high again, and the doctor had insisted on urgent tests. The peach silk dress, though elegant, couldn't disguise her pallor and the sweat beading on her face. It was then that her eyes fell on the small, unconscious figure on the floor, surrounded by people who only watched without helping. "My God, isn't anyone going to do anything?" Daphne asked out loud, trying to approach the girl. "How can they be so inhumane?" The effort to bend down next to Rose made the world spin violently. Daphne felt her legs weaken and had to lean against the wall, her vision darkening at the edges. The baby in her womb stirred restlessly, as if sensing the mother's distress. At that moment, Rose began to slowly regain consciousness. "Little one, are you okay?" she asked weakly, forcing her body to help the girl get up. "My name is Daphne. Do you need help?" Despite her own fever, Rose, still groggy from the faint, managed to notice that the pregnant woman was trying to sustain her fur and help Daphne sit in one of the waiting room chairs. Her small hands were trembling with the effort, but firmly held the pregnant woman's arm. Around them, people who had previously ignored her now watched the scene with curiosity, especially seeing a simple girl who looked like a beggar helping such an elegant lady. How can a child in this state have more humanity than all of you? Daphne muttered, addressing the people around her. Little one, you're burning with fever. A new wave of dizziness hit Daphne, making her lean forward. Rose, even staggering, ran to the water fountain and came back with a cup of water. Her legs could barely support her, but something inside her compelled her to help that lady who, unlike the others, looked at her kindly. Small sips, ma'am, Rose instructed, helping Daphne drink. My grandma always says water helps when you feel sick. By the way, my name is Rose. Daphne drank the water slowly, her breath still irregular. Her face grew paler by the minute, and her hands trembled as she held the cup. Rose, noticing the woman's condition, began to fan her with a pamphlet she found on a nearby chair. I need my medicine, Daphne muttered, passing her hand over her belly. I forgot to take it before leaving home. I live a little far from here, in a Victorian mansion in Los Angeles. She gave the girl the address, seeming to ramble nervously. Rose noticed that the woman was sweating more and more. Carefully, even feeling her own fever rise, she took a clean handkerchief from her tattered backpack and began to dab Daphne's face. The gesture, so kind despite her own condition, brought tears to the woman's eyes. How can you be taking care of me while being so sick? Daphne asked, observing the feverish girl's face. You should be the one being attended to, not me. It was at this moment that a metallic glint caught Daphne's attention. The watch, which had fallen during Rose's faint, reflected the light coming in through the hospital window. Her eyes widened as she recognized the object, so similar to the one that had belonged to her husband's family for generations. What an interesting watch, Daphne casually commented, trying to control her surprise. It reminds me a lot of one that was lost years ago, a relic of the Cardins, my husband's family. Rose quickly grabbed the watch from the floor, holding it close to her chest. Daphne, still struggling with dizziness, continued speaking, her voice interrupted by labored breathing. The family had an identical watch to this one that was lost, she murmured, squeezing her eyes shut tightly. Daniel, my husband, must be so worried about me. He always insists that I don't go out without my medicine. A new wave of illness caused Daphne to groan softly. Rose, despite feeling her own body burning with fever, continued caring for the woman, offering more water and fanning her face. In her mind, however, the information was starting to connect. The watch, the mansion, the beginning of the name her grandmother started to mumble. But a new wave of illness caused Daphne to groan softly. Little one, you're trembling with fever, Daphne murmured, rummaging through her elegant purse. I forgot my blood pressure medicine, but I have a fever reducer here. Take it, it will help you feel better, she said, extending the medication to the girl. Rose hesitated for a moment but accepted the medicine the woman offered her. She was the first person, besides her grandmother, who had shown real concern for her well-being in a long time. Mom, you need a doctor immediately, Rose said softly, helping when a nurse finally appeared to assist her. As the nurse took Daphne inside the examination room, Rose remained in the waiting room, her mind spinning not only from the fever. The woman's words echoed in her head. Victorian mansion, family watch. Perhaps they were the answers she had been searching for. Grandma always said that nothing is by chance, thought Rose, clutching the watch to her chest as she watched Daphne disappear down the hallway. I need to find out if there is any connection, she thought determinedly, before taking the medication the woman had given her and beginning her search. The sun scorched the streets of Los Angeles as Rose walked towards the Cardin mansion. The fever reducer Daphne had given her at the hospital helped, but each step was still a challenge. The streets changed as she advanced, from poor neighborhoods to elegant avenues, from broken sidewalks to perfect asphalt, from simple houses to imposing mansions. I can't give up now, she murmured to herself, stopping to rest under a lush tree. Grandma needs me and this watch. This watch could be the key to everything. The path seemed endless under the afternoon sun. Rose had to stop several times to ask for directions, receiving suspicious looks from the well-dressed residents of the neighborhood. Her ragged clothes and sickly appearance stood in stark contrast to the well-dressed people walking their purebred dogs. Girl, the Cardin mansion is the next one on the right, number 1800, replied a maid sweeping a sidewalk, the only friendly face she encountered along the way. But be careful. The people there don't like, well, you know. The entrance to the street was like a portal to another world. Rose had never seen such tall and beautiful trees, their purple roses covering the entire length of the avenue. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees created patterns on the flawless asphalt, but she could barely appreciate them. The fever was starting to return, making her body tremble despite the afternoon heat. 1,500. 1,800, she repeated to herself, looking at the gilded numbers on the facades of the mansions. I need to find it before the fever gets worse. Each number she passed was a new discovery of luxury and opulence. Imported cars gleamed in open garages, enormous gardens displayed roses of every color, and elegant fountains gushed crystal-clear water. Rose felt smaller and more out of place with each one, her reflection in the mirrored windows showing a pale, feverish girl in worn clothes. I don't know if I did the right thing coming here, she thought, feeling a stronger wave of dizziness. But I can't turn back now, not after coming this far. The Carden mansion loomed imposingly on the corner, making Rose stop open-mouthed. It was easily 3 times larger than the other houses on the street, with wrought iron gates rising like silent guardians. Through the bars she could see a garden that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, with marble statues and perfectly aligned rose beds. Will someone in there have the answers I'm looking for? She whispered, clutching the watch tightly. Will I find out why Grandma started saying that name with Ma? The gentle sound of tires on the quiet street caught her attention. A sleek black limousine was approaching slowly, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Rose felt her heart race as she recognized Daphne, the woman from the hospital. It's now or never, she murmured, gathering all her courage as she watched the car gently stop in front of the gate. Even though the fever is coming back, I have to try. The automatic gate began to open with a soft hum, and Rose could see Daphne emerging from the back seat of the limousine. The elegant woman seemed much more composed than at the hospital, her face regaining color and her movements more steady. The fever made Rose tremble more and more, but she mustered the courage to take a step forward. Mrs. Daphne, she called with a trembling voice, I really need to speak with you. The change in Daphne's face was instantaneous. The kindness she had shown at the hospital vanished completely, replaced by an expression of confusion and distrust. The driver, a tall man in a dark suit, quickly positioned himself beside his employer. What are you doing here? Daphne questioned, her voice icy. Rose felt another wave of dizziness, but remained steadfast. With trembling fingers, she removed the watch from around her neck, holding it carefully in front of her. The light of the setting sun made the antique metal shine almost magically, highlighting the engraved initials on its surface. How did you get here, little one? Daphne asked again, her voice still maintaining a tone of concern. You should be resting, you still have a fever. The driver watched the scene attentively, but kept a respectful distance. Rose took another step forward, feeling her legs tremble not just from the fever, but from the importance of the moment. The medicine you gave me helped with the walk, Rose explained, clutching the watch in her hands. But I really needed to find you. Look at this watch. My grandmother said it has something to do with my father. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck Daphne. Her previously concerned face transformed into a mask of fury. Her eyes locked onto the watch in Rose's hands, and her hands began to tremble with rage. Your father, what absurd story is this? Daphne shouted, her voice echoing through the silent garden. That watch has belonged to the Carden family for generations. It was stolen years ago. Rose felt tears burn her eyes, mixing with the sweat from her fever. She tried to explain again, but Daphne had already pulled her Italian leather purse from her phone. Guards! Guards, come to the gate immediately! She yelled into the phone, her eyes sparking with anger. There's a little thief here making up absurd stories. 2 burly guards quickly emerged from the back of the mansion, their serious expressions making their intentions clear. Rose felt her heart race with fear, the fever making the world spin even faster. Please, Mom, listen to me, Rose pleaded, her voice choked. My grandmother is in a coma. She tried to tell me about my father before. She began, but the woman cut her off. Get this girl out of here, Daphne ordered, interrupting the explanation. And if she comes back, call the police. The guards grabbed Rose's arms forcefully, beginning to drag her away from the gates. The watch nearly slipped from her trembling hands, but she managed to hold it close to her chest. Ma'am, please, Rose shouted, trying to resist. I just want to know the truth about my family. My grandmother said it was important. Daphne had already turned her back, walking towards the mansion with firm strides. The guards continued dragging Rose, their large hands hurting her small arms. It was then that something inside her exploded. With a strength born of desperation, she managed to break free of one of her arms and pulled her shirt collar down. "Look! Look, everyone!" she shouted with all the force her lungs allowed, the high fever now forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment. "I have this birthmark. It might have something to do with my father," she shouted, but was completely ignored. The guards threw the girl onto the sidewalk and simply returned to their posts, leaving Rose alone in front of the imposing gates of the mansion. The fever, momentarily forgotten during the confrontation with Daphne, returned with full force, making her small body tremble violently. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and casting long shadows across the immaculate garden. The cool evening breeze approaching made the garden trees dance a somber dance, their leaves whispering secrets Rose still didn't understand. Her eyes burned with the returning fever, and every movement seemed to sap her last ounces of strength. "I can't give up now," she murmured to herself, sitting on the sidewalk in front of the mansion, her back leaning against the cold wall. "There has to be a way to prove I'm not lying. Grandma wouldn't give me this watch without a reason." The hours dragged on as Rose watched the movement inside the house through the ornate gates. Employees passed by the illuminated windows, luxury cars came and went, but no one seemed to notice the feverish girl sitting on the sidewalk. The watch in her hands seemed to grow heavier and heavier, just like her eyelids struggling to stay open. The sky gradually darkened, and the first stars began to appear, shining faintly through the city's pollution. The garden lights automatically turned on, creating mysterious shadows dancing across the perfectly manicured flower beds. "God give me strength," she whispered, resting her hot head against the cold gate, the icy metal offering brief relief from her rising fever. "I can't faint here, not now. My grandma needs me, and I need to find out the truth before going back to her. I have to find someone who can help us." Her small fingers clutched the watch tightly, feeling every detail of the crafted metal, every scratch that told a story she didn't yet know. The distant sound of cars on the main avenue mixed with the muffled voices coming from the mansion, creating a strange symphony that lulled her solitary weight. The sky was completely dark when the main doors of the mansion creaked open. Rose, struggling against the dizziness of the high fever, raised her eyes to see a tall man hurriedly exiting. Even from a distance, she could notice his elegant posture, the impeccable suit, and most importantly, the tie firmly adjusted around his neck. The man walked with firm strides along the stone garden path, his shadows multiplying under the strategically positioned lights. There was something in the way he walked, in how he carried his shoulders, that made Rose's heart beat faster. Could it be him? She thought, her heart pounding so hard it seemed like it wanted to leap out of her chest, her hands trembling not just from fever, but from the emotion of the moment. Will I finally find out the truth? Hope and fear mingled in her chest as she watched every move the man made, searching his gestures for any sign of connection to her own story. The watch in her hands seemed to pulse with its own life, as if recognizing the proximity of its former owner. The man was walking towards a parked car, but something made him stop abruptly in the middle of the stone path. Perhaps it was the sound of Rose struggling to get up, her worn shoes scraping against the concrete of the sidewalk, or perhaps it was mere intuition, that mysterious force that binds people destined to meet. When he turned around, the streetlight illuminated his neck, and for a brief moment Rose could see. There, partially hidden by his perfectly adjusted Italian tie, was a mark identical to hers, that little heart that had always made her feel different from the other children. Sir Daniel," Rose called out, her voice weak from fever but laden with an emotion that came from the depths of her soul. "Please, I need to show you something." Her legs were trembling so much that she had to lean on the gate railings, her tiny fingers intertwining with the cold metal as she struggled to remain standing. The man approached the gate with hesitant steps, his eyes fixed on the feverish girl who could barely stand. There was something in his gaze, curiosity, concern, or perhaps an unconscious recognition that he himself did not yet comprehend. The light from the street lamps cast dancing shadows across his aristocratic face, highlighting features that, if Rose could see better through her fever-blurred vision, she would recognize as similar to her own. The silence of the night seemed to amplify each of his steps toward the gate, each accelerated beat of her heart. With trembling hands, Rose raised the antique watch, letting it gleam under the streetlight. Daniel's eyes widened as he recognized the object, and his hand instinctively touched his tie, as if wanting to further conceal the mark they shared. The shine of the ancient metal seemed to hypnotize both father and daughter, united in that suspended moment in time, while the shadows of the garden danced around them like silent witnesses to this long-destined encounter. "This watch," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion he tried unsuccessfully to control. "How did you find it?" His hands, which always seemed so steady when signing million-dollar contracts, now visibly trembled as he approached the bars that separated him from a truth he never imagined encountering on an apparently ordinary night. Rose took a step forward, her legs wobbly from the high fever consuming her small body. The world spun around her like an uncontrolled carousel, but she needed to stay conscious for a few more moments, needed to make him understand. With trembling fingers, she pulled down the collar of her shirt, revealing the heart-shaped mark she had always carried as a mystery. The streetlight perfectly illuminated that sign of destiny, while the cold night wind made the leaves of the trees whisper as if telling long-kept secrets. "This mark," Rose whispered, tears streaming down her feverish face that glowed under the artificial light. "Is it the same as yours?" The girl asked to confirm her suspicions, the words seeming to float in the night air, laden with a truth as heavy as the watch she still held in her trembling hands. The distant sound of cars on the main avenue had disappeared, as if the entire world had stopped to witness this moment. Daniel staggered slightly, leaning against the gate that separated them. His hands trembled as he loosened his expensive tie, fully revealing the mark he had always tried to hide from the world. It was identical to Rose's. Same heart shape, same exact place on the neck, same slightly pinkish hue that seemed to glow in the nightlight. The powerful businessman, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, now seemed completely vulnerable in the face of this unexpected revelation. "The watch Grandma gave me to keep. She found me with it. When she rescued me," said Rose, her voice shaking with the effort to remain conscious as beads of sweat ran down her pale face. Her small hands raised the precious object once more, allowing the streetlight to reveal every detail of its time-worn surface. The ancient metal shone as if it had a life of its own, reflecting off the gate bars and creating small dancing points of light around them. The fever made her body tremble more and more, but she remained steadfast, sustaining the weight of that crucial moment. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he examined every detail of the watch through the gate bars. His trembling hands traced over the initials engraved on the back, over the small scratch on the right side that he himself had made so many years ago. It was impossible not to recognize that object that carried so many memories, so many secrets, so many untold stories. The powerful man, accustomed to maintaining control in all situations, now seemed completely lost in his own emotions, his normally impassive face now a mask of shock and recognition. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice choked by the emotion that threatened to suffocate him. "This watch, I thought it was lost forever." His words came out broken, as if each syllable cost an immense effort. The night wind ruffled the leaves of the garden trees, creating a soft music that seemed to cradle that moment suspended in time. Rose felt her legs grow weaker, the world spinning in a whirlwind of lights and shadows around her. The fever now seemed to consume every part of her small body, making her tremble violently. But she needed to say it, needed to make him understand before her strength ran out completely. With one last heroic effort, she raised her eyes to meet his, so similar to her own. The same brown hue, the same shine now overflowing with contained tears. The moment seemed suspended in the night air, as if time itself had stopped to witness this predestined encounter. "Dad," she said, her voice laden with all the hope kept for years, of all the nights dreaming of this moment, of all the unanswered questions that had haunted her during her short life. The word hovered in the air like a revelation, echoing through the silent mansion gardens, rebounding off the imposing walls, dancing with the shadows cast by the street lamps. "I found you," she completed, her last strength ebbing away like the light of day that had long since departed. Daniel's face, already pale from the revelation of the watch and the identical mark, completely lost its color. His eyes fixed on the all-too-familiar details of the watch and the mark identical to his own, began to lose focus. His entire world, so carefully constructed over the years, seemed to crumble before that simple word, Dad. His legs faltered under the weight of that unexpected truth, and he staggered backwards, as if he had been struck by a physical blow. "It can't, Helen," was all he managed to mumble, his last words getting lost in the night air as his body collapsed heavily on the entrance floor, the dull thud echoing through the silent garden like the final period of a story that was only beginning to be revealed. The dull thud of Daniel's body hitting the ground made Rose react instantly. Without thinking about the fever consuming her own body, she began shaking the gate forcefully, screaming for help as the first raindrop touched her flushed face. Her little hands gripped the ornate railings, desperately trying to find a way to reach her father. "Please, wake up, you can't faint now," she shouted, her voice hoarse from the fever. "I need you to know the truth, I need you to understand who I am." Daphne emerged through the main door like a hurricane of silk and expensive perfume, her heels echoing against the marble entrance. Upon seeing Daniel lying there, her elegant face transformed into a mask of pure terror. A rain started to fall over them suddenly and increased in intensity with every second, turning the pregnant woman's expensive dress into a soaked rag as she threw herself beside her husband. The servants began to crowd at the mansion's windows, their pale faces watching the scene unfolding in the garden. "Daniel, my love, for God's sake, answer!" Daphne shouted, her hands trembling as she touched her husband's face. "Someone call an ambulance now." The mansion's garden turned into chaos of voices and hurried footsteps. The rain fell harder and harder, creating a liquid curtain that distorted Rose's vision. She watched helpless as the guards ran in all directions, some on the phone, others trying to protect Daniel from the rain with their coats. The watch in her hands seemed to pulse, as if it could sense the proximity of its true owner. "Let me help," Rose pleaded, her voice almost lost in the noise of the storm. "He's my father, I have the right to be by his side." Daphne, soaked and desperate, shouted orders in every direction, her usual composure completely forgotten. Her perfectly styled hair now clung to her face as she held Daniel's inert hand. The sound of a siren began to cut through the rainy night, rapidly approaching the mansion. Rose felt her strength diminishing, but continued clinging to the gate railings, determined not to lose sight of her father. "Sir, please don't take him to heaven now," she murmured in a desperate prayer. "I just found him, I can't lose him like this." The ambulance arrived in a blaze of red lights that tinted the raindrops. The paramedics quickly got out, carrying equipment and a stretcher, passing by Rose as if she were invisible. In seconds they were by Daniel's side, their professional voices cutting through the night air as they checked his vital signs. Daphne had been gently pushed aside by one of the guards and now paced back and forth, biting her perfectly manicured fingernails. "His blood pressure is very low," announced one of the paramedics, moving swiftly. "We need to take him immediately." The moment of transferring Daniel to the ambulance seemed to happen in slow motion for Rose. Her body trembled violently, the fever reaching alarming levels, but her eyes never left her father's lifeless figure being carried on the stretcher. Daphne quickly climbed into the ambulance without even looking back, without noticing the girl who begged to go along. The doors closed with a dull thud, and the siren cut through the night once more. "He didn't even have a chance to really get to know me," Rose whispered to herself, her tears mingling with the rain. "I couldn't even tell him that I always wanted to know who he was. I always wanted to have a daddy." With the ambulance's departure, the chaos in the garden began to dissipate. The guards returned to their posts, the servants disappeared back into the mansion, and Rose was left alone on the sidewalk, as if she had never existed. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, soaking her already wet clothes, making her feverish body shiver even more. The watch in her hands now seemed to weigh a ton. Grandma Hazel was right, she thought, feeling her legs weakening. Sometimes the truth hurts more than the lie. The world began to spin alarmingly around Rose. The garden lights turned into golden blurs, and the sound of the rain seemed to come from far away. Her legs, which could barely support her anymore, finally gave way. She slid down the wet wall, still clinging to the watch, as if it were her last anchor to reality. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she murmured, feeling consciousness slipping away. "I wasn't strong enough." Darkness began to envelop Rose like a heavy blanket. Her small, feverish body rested against the mansion's wall, the rain washing her pale face. The watch still shone faintly in her hands, holding all the secrets she had fought so hard to reveal. The last words escaped her lips as a whisper. "Dad, I just wanted you to know." The first rays of morning sun found Ruth heading out for her daily routine. The mansion's oldest maid walked through the garden still wet from the previous night's rain, her immaculate white uniform contrasting with the scenery. It was then that her eyes fell on the small, motionless figure leaning against the wall. The watering can she carried fell from her hands, shattering on the ground. "Holy Mother of God!" she exclaimed, running towards the unconscious girl. "What happened to you, child?" Hours later, the hospital room was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the constant beep of the cardiac monitors. Daniel began to awaken slowly, his eyes adjusting to the bright light streaming through the window. Memories of the previous night flooded his mind in confused flashes. The familiar clock, the birthmark identical to his own, the girl's eyes that so resembled other eyes he had tried to forget years ago. His hand instinctively touched his neck, where his tie no longer hid his most well-kept secret. "The girl. Where is the girl?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse from weakness. "I need to find her. She has the same mark as me." Daphne, who had dozed off in an armchair near the bed, awoke to the sound of her husband's voice. Her normally impeccable face showed clear signs of a sleepless night, and her eyes were red and swollen. She quickly approached the bed, gripping Daniel's hand tightly as if fearing he might disappear. The man, however, seemed distant, his eyes fixed on an undefined point on the white wall of the room. "Daniel, my love, you gave me such a terrible fright," said Daphne, trying to catch his attention. "The doctor said it was a blood pressure issue. We need to take better care of your health. The pregnancy is affecting both our blood pressures," she joked, trying to ease her husband's nervousness. Daphne's words seemed to fail to reach Daniel, who remained lost in his own memories. Helen's face, so young and full of life, danced in his memory like an old photograph refusing to fade. Those months of forbidden love in the mansion gardens, the hidden encounters in the tool shed, the whispered promises under the moonlight, it all came back with overwhelming force. "Daphne, I need to tell you something," he finally spoke, his voice trembling with the weight of the confession to come. "Something that happened a long time ago before we met. Something about Helen, our former maid." The name seemed to linger in the hospital room air like a long-forgotten ghost. Daphne felt her knees weaken and had to lean on the hospital bed. Her hands, always so steady and elegant, were now visibly shaking. Daniel closed his eyes, gathering courage to continue his confession. The words that followed seemed to tear at his throat, laden with years of guilt and remorse. "Helen was more than just a maid," he continued, his voice choked with emotion. "We fell in love, Daphne. It was a forbidden love, but as real as anything I've ever felt in my life." The story now flowed like a dammed river, finally finding its way to the sea. Daniel told of the exchanged glances during work, the conversations that lingered beyond what was necessary, the first stolen kiss among the rose bushes in the garden. His voice trembled as he recalled how the two young lovers planned to run away together, dreaming of a life away from the social conventions that separated them. Tears streamed freely down his face as he described the moment his family discovered the romance. "My father gave me an ultimatum," he confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "Either I ended everything with her and fired her, or she would have her career tarnished throughout the city. I was a coward, Daphne. Such a coward." Daphne listened in silence, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Daniel continued his narrative, describing how he was forced to fire Helen, how he had to pretend that nothing between them had been real. His hands gripped the hospital sheet tightly as he recalled the last look she gave him before leaving, a look he now recognized in the girl's eyes from the previous night. "I never heard from her again, Daphne," he said, his voice broken with emotion. "But that girl must be her daughter, our daughter." The cardiac monitor began to register accelerated heartbeats as Daniel tossed and turned in the bed, trying to sit up. His eyes, once clouded by his confession, now shone with a renewed urgency. The mark on his neck seemed to burn with the intensity of his emotions. A nurse quickly entered the room, alerted by the monitor signs, but Daniel barely noticed her. "I need to find my daughter," he declared, his voice stronger now. Helen must have found out she was pregnant after she left. How could I have been so blind? He asked himself. The following hours were a whirlwind of emotions in the hospital room. Doctors came and went, checking Daniel's vital signs, recommending calm and rest. But he seemed deaf to all medical advice. His mind focused solely on the revelation that had changed his life. Daphne remained silent, processing everything she had discovered. "Daphne, please," Daniel implored, holding his wife's hand. "You have to help me find her. My daughter has my eyes, my mark. She is my blood. She is the blood of the child you're expecting, my love." The afternoon sun began to set when Daphne finally broke her silence. Her eyes, once brimming with tears, were now dry and distant. She rose from the armchair where she had been sitting, walking to the hospital window. The city stretched out below, indifferent to the drama unfolding in that room. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the curtain, as if seeking a distraction from what she was about to say. "Daniel," she began, her voice controlled, "you were not in a condition to understand what happened yesterday." Daniel tossed and turned even more in the bed, ignoring the pain the movement caused. His eyes pleaded for answers that Daphne seemed reluctant to give. The hospital room suddenly seemed too small to contain all the tension growing between them. The shadows of dusk danced on the white walls, creating distorted shapes that seemed to mock their anguish. "Daphne, where is the girl?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Please tell me someone helped her, that someone brought her here." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Daphne finally turned to face her husband, her face a mask of false compassion. Her words, when they finally came, fell into the room like stones in a still pond, creating waves of devastation that threatened to engulf Daniel. "I thought she was lying," Daphne said, her voice as cold as the hospital's air conditioning. "She just looked like a beggar trying to take advantage of our family. How could I know?" Daniel felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been punched. His eyes widened in horror, fixed on Daphne as if he were seeing her for the first time. The heart monitor began to beat more rapidly, reflecting his growing agitation. His wife's words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely coming out. "Daphne, what did you say about my daughter?" The last ray of sunlight of the day streamed through the hospital window, illuminating Daphne's face for a moment. Her next words fell into the silence of the room like a final confession, sealing the fate of all those involved in that story of love and betrayal. "I met her at the hospital. She was burning with fever, Daniel. You know how I babble when I'm nervous, and I accidentally gave her our address. When she arrived at the mansion, I thought she wanted to deceive us," Daphne said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you fell ill, and I left her outside in the rain. I don't know what happened to her or where she went." The machines began to beep frantically as Daniel absorbed the impact of that revelation. His daughter, the one he had just discovered, had been abandoned on that rainy night, sick and alone. The despair on his face was palpable as he tried to process the cruelty of that situation. "You abandoned her," he whispered, his voice laden with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "My God, Daphne, she could be dead now." The hospital room plunged into a deafening silence, broken only by the monotonous sound of the monitors. The truth hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Daniel closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his face as the reality hit him with full force. The daughter he never knew he had, the product of his forbidden love with Helen, had been so close, and now she was lost again. "Where are you, my little one?" he murmured into the emptiness of the room. "What happened to you that night?" Ruth carried Rose's unconscious body into her small house behind the mansion, her trembling hands struggling to open the door while supporting the feverish girl. The humble room felt even smaller with the urgency of the situation. Placing Rose on her own bed, Ruth began to remove the drenched clothes from the girl, replacing them with one of her old outfits. The sound of Rose's labored, wheezing breathing filled the small space, making the maid's heart tighten with worry. "Good Lord, this girl is burning with fever," Ruth murmured, brushing her hand across Rose's sweaty forehead. "What did they do to you, child?" The fever wouldn't subside, no matter how many cold compresses Ruth placed on Rose's forehead. The girl's breathing grew worse by the minute, turning into a deep, painful cough that shook her tiny frame. Ruth rushed to her medicine cabinet, her hands trembling as she searched for something that could help. The few medications she had seemed inadequate in the face of the severity of the situation. "I can't let you get worse like this," she whispered, holding Rose's hot hand. "I need to find a way to get you medical help," she mumbled to herself. The wet sound of Rose's breathing became more alarming with every passing hour. Ruth watched helplessly as the girl struggled to draw breath, her lips taking on a slightly bluish tint that made the maid's blood run cold. The decision was made when another bout of coughing shook Rose's frail body, and red droplets stained the white pillowcase. Without a second thought, Ruth gathered her savings and called a taxi. "I have to take you to the hospital," she decided, wrapping Rose in her own coat. "You need a doctor even if I have to beg for help." The hospital was crowded when Ruth arrived carrying Rose in her arms. The emergency room was chaos, filled with sick people, crying children, and hurried doctors rushing from one side to the other. After what seemed an eternity of waiting, they finally received attention. The doctor, a grey-haired man with a tired look, examined Rose with increasing concern, his expression growing more serious by the moment. "It's pneumonia and a severe case," he announced, listening to the girl's chest. "She needs specific medication immediately, or the situation could become even more complicated," the doctor explained. Ruth felt her legs weaken as she heard the price of the medications the doctor prescribed. A whole month's salary would barely cover half the required amount. Her savings, carefully guarded over the years, had already been spent on the taxi and the first tests. The doctor kept talking about the severity of the situation, about how every lost hour could be fatal, but Ruth could barely hear, her mind spinning in search of a solution. "How will I get so much money?" she thought, anguished. "This girl will die if I don't do something quickly." The return home was torture. Rose, now with an improvised oxygen mask, breathed with even more difficulty. Ruth had managed to get some basic medications at the hospital pharmacy, but knew they wouldn't be enough. The prescription in her pocket seemed to burn like an ember, constantly reminding her of the time she was losing. "Hang in there, little one," she murmured, holding Rose closer. "I'll find a way to get your medicine, even if I have to sell everything I have." Night fell over the small back house. Rose's fever remained high, and her breathing now came in painful gasps that cut the heart of anyone who heard it. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her helplessness, each tick-tock reminding her that time was running out. If only Mr. Daniel wasn't in the hospital, thought Ruth, placing another cold compress on Rose's face. He has always been generous with the employees. It was then that an idea came to her tired mind. Daniel had always allowed employees to request advances in case of emergency. Even from the hospital, she knew he would continue managing some company matters by cell phone. She had seen him doing it herself when she brought his breakfast to his room every time he fell ill. The millionaire rarely stopped to rest. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, her boss's number engraved in her memory after so many years of service. "May God forgive me for disturbing a sick man," she murmured, looking at Rose, "but I have no other choice." The phone rang several times before Daniel's weak voice answered. Ruth felt her heart tighten at the sound of the weariness in his voice, he himself still recovering from his illness. The words came stumbling out of her mouth as she explained the situation, carefully omitting that it was a girl found at the mansion's gates. "Mr. Daniel, forgive the disturbance," she said, her voice trembling. "I know you are sick, but I really need your help." Daniel listened in silence as Ruth explained about the urgent need for money for medications. His voice, even weak, maintained the kindness he had always shown to his older employees. On the other end of the line, Ruth could hear the sound of the hospital monitors, reminding her that her boss was also in a delicate situation. "It's a health emergency," she continued, trying to keep her voice steady. "I promise to repay everything as soon as I can. You know I have never failed in my obligations." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Ruth could hear Rose's labored breathing mixed with the soft sound of the hospital machines through the phone. Her hands gripped the handset so tightly that her knuckles were white. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine concern. "Ruth, you have always been more than an employee to this family," he said softly. "How much do you need?" Tears streamed freely down Ruth's face as she mentioned the amount. It was a considerable sum, more than she had ever asked for in all her years of service. The sound of a particularly strong cough from Rose made her voice falter for a moment. Daniel, however, did not hesitate. "I'll transfer the money right now," he replied, and Ruth could hear the sound of keys being typed. "I hope it helps whoever is in need," he said. An immense relief flooded Ruth's chest as she heard the sound of the transfer confirmation on her cell phone. Her legs finally gave way, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, the phone still pressed to her ear. Rose began coughing again, a wet and painful sound that made Ruth jump up quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Daniel," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You have no idea how much you're helping." Daniel's parting words were almost lost in the sound of Rose's coughing. "Take good care of whoever needs this help, Ruth," he said softly. "Something tells me it was your good heart that made you call me. Count on me for whatever you need." Ruth hung up the phone with trembling hands. The soft touch of the cell phone confirming the bank transfer echoed through the silent room. Ruth was already picking up her purse, preparing to run to the nearest 24-hour pharmacy. The money she had just received from her boss seemed like a divine gift at that moment of despair. "Hold on just a little longer, little one," she whispered, touching Rose's feverish face. "God has put good people in our path." After days of intensive care and constant medication, Rose finally opened her eyes lucidly. Ruth's small room was illuminated by the soft light of dawn, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the environment. The maid, who had slept in an improvised chair by the bed, woke instantly upon hearing the girl move. Pneumonia still left Rose's breathing a little heavy, but the fever had subsided significantly. "How long have I been sleeping and waking up?" Rose asked, her voice still hoarse. "I need to see my grandmother at the hospital. She must be so worried." Ruth helped Rose sit up in bed, adjusting the pillows for more comfort. Her gentle hands checked the girl's temperature, satisfied to notice that the fever had practically disappeared. The expensive medicine had taken effect, worth every penny of the advance she had requested from her employer. With maternal firmness, she prevented Rose from trying to get out of bed when the girl made a move to leave it. The concern etched on the young face broke her heart, but she knew she had to be firm. "You almost died, child," Ruth said, her voice mixing affection and authority. "You need to regain your strength before thinking about leaving here." The hours dragged on as Rose tried to convince Ruth to let her go see her grandmother. The girl barely touched the soup the maid had prepared with such care. Her mind focused solely on the concern for Hazel. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her anxiety, each tic-tac reminding her of the precious time she was losing. Her breathing was still a bit difficult, and occasionally a stubborn cough would make her double over in pain. "You don't understand, Mom," Rose pleaded, holding Ruth's hands. "My grandmother is alone in the hospital. She needs me." The sun was already high in the sky when Ruth finally left to fetch more medicine from the pharmacy. Rose waited a few minutes after hearing the gate close, her heart racing at the prospect of escaping. Ignoring the weakness in her legs and the pain in her chest with each deeper breath, she dressed as quickly as she could in her tattered clothes. Her fingers trembled as she tied the laces of her worn sneakers, but her determination was stronger than any physical discomfort. "Forgive me, Ruth," she whispered to the empty room, "but I can't abandon my grandmother." The path to the community hospital seemed much longer now that her body was still fighting the remnants of pneumonia. Each step was an effort, and the city air seemed to scratch her already weakened lungs. The strong midday sun made her head throb, and several times she had to stop to catch her breath. People passed by her without noticing her condition, some even complaining when she had to lean against walls to avoid falling. The hospital was even more crowded than usual. Rose dragged herself through the familiar hallways, her heart clenching at seeing so many people waiting for care. When she finally reached the room where she had left Hazel, she found a scene that made her blood run cold. Two doctors were conversing in low voices beside the bed, their grave expressions saying more than any words could. Her grandmother's frail figure looked even smaller connected to so many machines, her skin taking on an ashen tone that frightened Rose. "Please tell me she'll be okay," the girl begged, her voice faltering. "She's all I have in the world." The words of the older doctor fell like stones on Rose. Each sentence was a blow to her hopes. Extremely serious condition, limited resources, guarded prognosis. Her mind whirled trying to process all the information, but one phrase stood out like a beacon in the darkness. In a private hospital, with more modern equipment, perhaps she would have a chance. The doctor continued speaking, but Rose no longer heard him. An idea was beginning to form in her feverish mind. I need to find my father, she thought, determined. He has money, he can save Grandma. The decision was made before her weakened body could protest. Ignoring the doctor's warnings about her own health still being frail, Rose headed for the hospital exit. Her legs trembled with the effort, and each breath was a small battle, but the image of Hazel fighting for her life gave her strength to continue. She remembered overhearing the name of the hospital her father would be taken to on the day she fainted. The private hospital where her father was admitted was on the other side of town, but she couldn't waste any more time. Now is not the time to be weak, she told herself, swallowing another coughing fit. Grandma was always strong for me, now it's my turn to be strong for her. The journey to the private hospital seemed like a desert crossing. The relentless sun punished her back, and the air conditioning of the stores she passed created temperature variations that made her cough worse. Several times she had to stop, her body protesting against the excessive strain. People looked at her with suspicion when she sat on the sidewalks to catch her breath, some even crossing to the other side to avoid her. I can't give up now, she repeated to herself like a mantra. Dad will help me, he has to help. When she finally glimpsed the imposing facade of the private hospital, Rose felt her last reserves of strength renewed. The modern building, with its glass walls reflecting the afternoon sun, seemed another world compared to the community hospital where Hazel was. Her faltering steps led her to the luxurious reception, where a well-dressed attendant looked at her with obvious disapproval. Her voice came out hoarse and weak when she tried to speak. Please, I need to see Mr. Daniel Carden. He's my father. The reaction was immediate and cruel. The receptionist looked disdainfully at Rose's worn clothes, her nose wrinkling as if she smelled something unpleasant. Another beggar trying to pass herself off as a patient's relative, she said loudly to her colleague, making sure Rose heard. As if a ragged beggar could be Mr. Carden's daughter. Before Rose could show the birthmark or explain about the watch, two burly security guards appeared by her side, as if by magic. Their large hands grabbed the girl's thin arms with unnecessary force, while other hospital staff watched the scene with a mixture of disgust and amusement. These people have no shame, commented a nurse, shaking her head. They make up all kinds of stories to try to extort patients. Rose tried to resist, but her body, weakened by illness, was no match for the strong men who dragged her without any gentleness. Please, listen to me, she cried, her voice turning into another coughing fit. I can prove it. Look at the mark on my neck. My grandmother will die if he doesn't help. The fresh outdoor air hit her face like a slap when the guards pushed her out. Rose stumbled, nearly falling, her weak legs barely able to keep her upright. The people passing by pretended not to see the scene, some even quickening their pace to get away faster. One of the guards pointed a threatening finger in her direction before turning back to his post. If you come back, we'll call the police, he warned her in a harsh voice. We're tired of beggars trying to take advantage of patients. The humiliation burned more than the fever on her face. Rose leaned against a nearby pole, struggling to breathe as she watched the guards return inside the hospital. Through the glass doors, she could see the receptionist making a dismissive gesture in her direction, probably telling someone about the brazen beggar who had tried to get in. How am I going to get to talk to my father now? She thought, feeling the tears start to fall. Grandma needs that help. She can't die. Rose's strength finally began to give way. Her body, still recovering from pneumonia, protested against all the day's exertion. The cough returned with full force, making her chest hurt as if it were being pierced by 1,000 needles. People kept passing by, some now casting pitying looks, but no one stopped to help. I can't give up, she muttered to herself even as she felt her legs faltering. I need to find another way to get to him. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange that seemed to mock Rose's desperate situation. The guards kept watching her through the glass doors, making sure she didn't try to enter again. Her body trembled with the effort of staying upright, and each breath seemed harder than the last. The image of Hazel, alone in her hospital bed, brought fresh tears to her eyes. Forgive me, Grandma, she whispered, feeling the sadness weigh on her shoulders. I tried, I swear I tried, but I'll try as many times as it takes. I won't give up. Just 15 minutes after being kicked out, Rose was already trying to get back into the hospital. This time she approached from a different angle, blending in with a group of visitors arriving for visiting hours. Her heart raced as she crossed the automatic doors, trying to look natural despite her worn clothes and disheveled hair. The same guards recognized her instantly. "This girl just doesn't give up," one of them shouted, advancing towards her with heavy steps. "How many times do we have to kick you out today?" one of them asked as Rose tried to run, but her illness-weakened legs barely responded. "I just need to talk to my father," she yelled as she was dragged away. "Please, it's a matter of life and death." Half an hour later, Rose was trying again. Now her strategy was different. She tried to enter through the back door, where deliveries were made. She quickly observed the movement of the staff, and when a supply truck arrived, tried to sneak in with the delivery men. She made it to the kitchen this time, the smell of food making her empty stomach growl. A staff member saw her and immediately called security. "You again?" said the taller guard, grabbing her arm forcefully. "You're starting to irritate me, girl." Rose tried to explain about the birthmark, about the watch, but no one wanted to listen. Not even an hour had passed when Rose made her third attempt. This time she pretended to pass out at the hospital entrance, purposefully falling near the main door. Her cough, still real due to the not yet fully cured pneumonia, made the scene more convincing. Some people stopped to help, but before she could be taken inside, the same guards appeared. "It's that beggar girl again," one of them said to the gathering crowd. "She's been trying to get in since early, making up absurd stories." The humiliation burned on her face as she was once again kicked out, now under the pitying and disdainful looks of passers-by. In the early afternoon, Rose made her fourth attempt. This time, she waited for a moment of distraction from the guards during the shift change and ran as fast as her weak legs allowed. She managed to reach the elevator, her heart pounding out of sync with the hope of finally achieving her goal. The doors began to close, but one of the guards managed to catch her in time. The man grabbed her around the waist, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. "You just don't learn, do you?" he growled, carrying her out as she struggled. "Next time I'll call the police and then you'll see. You'll get arrested and stop giving us trouble." With each passing hour, her attempts became more and more desperate. In one of them, she tried to hide inside a laundry cart, but the smell of illness on her clothes gave her away to one of the staff members. In another, she tried to convince an elderly lady to say she was her granddaughter, but the woman, frightened by her sick appearance, called security immediately. With each failure, Rose felt her body weaken further, but the image of Hazel alone in the community hospital gave her strength to continue. "I can't give up now," she muttered to herself between fits of coughing. "Grandma never gave up on me. I can't give up on her." The sun was beginning to set when Rose made her last desperate attempt. Taking advantage of the arrival of an ambulance, she tried to enter through the emergency room along with the paramedics. Her cough, which worsened with every hour, made her acting as a patient more convincing. For a moment she almost succeeded. She even made it onto a stretcher. But one of the nurses recognized her from her previous attempts. "It's that troublesome girl," he alerted his colleagues. "She's been trying to get in since morning, making up all sorts of stories." Once again, Rose was kicked out under looks of contempt and malicious comments. The first stars were beginning to appear in the sky when Rose finally surrendered to exhaustion. Her body, drained from all the failed attempts, could barely stand. She dragged herself to a bench in the plaza in front of the hospital, from where she could observe the lit windows. The night brought with it a cold breeze that made her body shiver, but she refused to leave. "He's somewhere in there," she thought, her eyes fixed on the hundreds of windows. So close and yet so far. The night wore on as Rose continued her solitary vigil. The lights in the hospital rooms went out one by one, but her eyes remained fixed on the windows, waiting to see a sign of her father. A light drizzle began to fall, making her body shiver even more. On the third floor, a female figure appeared at one of the windows. It was Daphne, gazing absent-mindedly at the rainy night. Her eyes briefly passed over the plaza, but she didn't recognize the small, huddled figure on the bench. The rain began to thicken, turning the drizzle into a liquid curtain that soaked Rose to the bone. Her body trembled violently now, partly from the cold, partly from the illness that threatened to return in full force. Still, she refused to leave her observation post. The cough returned, stronger than before, making her chest ache as if it were being ripped from the inside. "Just a little longer," she muttered to herself, her teeth chattering from the cold. Tomorrow I'll try again. Even if I have to die trying, I have to save my grandma. This may be the last thing I do, I don't care, as long as my granny is okay. The hours dragged on as the rain continued to fall mercilessly. Rose had curled up as much as possible on the bench, trying to find some shelter under the small cover of the plaza. Her body alternated between violent shivers and a worrying stillness. The pneumonia, which had barely been cured, began to show signs of returning. I can't get sick now, she thought, feeling her breathing becoming increasingly difficult. I need to be strong to try again tomorrow. The early morning brought even heavier rain and a biting cold that seemed to penetrate her bones. Rose could no longer stop coughing, and each breath was a painful struggle. Her soaked clothes clung to her body like a second icy skin, while the fever began to rise again. The world around her started to blur, the lights of the hospital turning into golden blurs dancing in her vision. "Please, not now," she pleaded to no one in particular. "I can't give up." The rising sun found Rose in a worrying state. Her body shook uncontrollably, alternating between violent chills and waves of heat from the high fever. The cough had turned into a wet, painful sound that made her chest burn with every breath. People passing through the plaza cast concerned looks at the clearly ill girl, but no one stopped to help. "Grandma," she muttered in her feverish delirium, "forgive me for not being strong enough." The world was starting to spin around Rose, the images blending into a confused kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. Her breathing was becoming increasingly difficult, and the fever made her body alternate between freezing cold and unbearable heat. The voices of the people passing by seemed to come from very far away, as if she were hearing everything through a thick wall. In her lucid moments, she could still see the window where Daphne had appeared the night before. "Why does no one believe me?" she thought, feeling her consciousness starting to slip away. "Why is it so hard to get to you, Dad?" The sun was already high in the sky when Rose lost the battle against the illness. Her body, weakened by the night in the rain and the return of pneumonia, finally gave in. The last thing she saw before darkness took over was the imposing facade of the hospital, so close and yet so unattainable. "I couldn't make it," were her last words before losing consciousness. "I tried in every way, but I couldn't make it." The morning was already well advanced when Daphne decided to go for a brief walk through the hospital gardens, needing to clear her mind after another tense night caring for Daniel. The fresh air and gentle sun seemed an invitation to clear her mind of the worries that consumed her. However, as she passed through the square in front of the hospital, something caught her attention. A small figure lay motionless on one of the benches, her body visibly shivering even under the morning sun. As she approached the bench, Daphne felt her heart miss a beat. It was the same girl she had seen at the hospital, the one who claimed to be Daniel's daughter. Her small body trembled violently under her soaked clothes, and her breathing came in painful gasps that made her chest rise and fall irregularly. Guilt hit Daphne like a punch in the stomach as she remembered that she had ordered the guards to expel the girl. "My God, what have I done?" she murmured, touching Rose's feverish face. "How could I be so cruel to a child?" Guilt and fear took hold of Daphne as she recognized Rose. She was her stepdaughter. She saw the same mark as Daniel's on the girl's neck. The small body trembled violently on the park bench, and her breathing came in painful gasps that made her chest rise and fall irregularly. How had she been able to ignore the desperate pleas of that child? "My God, this girl is the sister of the son in my womb," she murmured, touching Rose's feverish face. "She could die because of me. I ignored her and didn't believe her. How could I be so distrustful of a little child?" With trembling hands of concern, Daphne tried to wake the girl. Rose's skin burned with fever, and her clothes were still soaked from the previous night's rain. The child's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused, before closing again. The heart-shaped mark on her neck, so similar to Daniel's, seemed to accuse Daphne of her negligence. "Please, hang in there," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "I need to fix my mistake. I need to take you to your father." Despair took hold of Daphne when she realized the gravity of Rose's condition. Without a second thought, she mustered strengths she didn't know she possessed and lifted the girl into her arms, even with her protruding pregnant belly. The small light body trembled against her chest as disconnected words escaped her feverish lips. Rose was insistently calling for Hazel, begging for help to save her. "Grandma, private hospital. Dad, help," she mumbled in her delirium. "Help me get to him." Daphne ran toward the hospital, her tears mingling with the sweat of effort and the pain in her back from carrying the child in her arms. The guards, who had previously expelled Rose so many times on her orders, now quickly made way when they saw who she was carrying. The weight of guilt seemed to crush Daphne with every step. She could have avoided all of this if she had only listened, if she had given the girl a chance to explain. "Call the emergency team," she shouted, her voice laden with urgency. "This girl may be my husband's daughter, the Carden." The hospital emergency room sprang into action immediately. Doctors and nurses ran back and forth, preparing equipment and a stretcher to attend to Rose. The girl's body, now completely limp, was still murmuring words that broke everyone's hearts. The mark on her neck, exposed when they removed her wet clothes, was undeniable proof of her possible connection to Daniel. "Forgive me, little one," Daphne whispered, holding Rose's feverish hand. "I'll do everything to save you." The doctors struggled to stabilize Rose, but her condition worsened by the minute. Daphne never left her side, tortured by guilt and fear of losing the one who could be her husband's daughter. The girl's deliriums intensified, her words revealing a story of love and devotion that Daphne had refused to listen to before. "Grandma Hazel, take care of me. Dad has to know," Rose mumbled between painful gasps. "The watch? Proof." It was then that Rose's body began to convulse violently. Her eyes rolled back in their sockets. The doctors were shouting urgent orders as they tried to control the seizure that was taking over her small, feverish body. Daphne held Rose's hand tightly, as if she could prevent life from slipping away through her fingers. "Don't let her die," she pleaded with the doctors. "Daniel would never forgive me. I would never forgive myself. She is my stepdaughter. She's just an innocent child." The convulsion was intensifying, making Rose's body arch in a frightening way on the stretcher. The monitors were triggering alarms as the doctors struggled to stabilize her. Daphne watched the scene in horror, knowing that her negligence had contributed to this situation. The girl's face, so similar to her husband's when seen up close, was contorted in pain. "Hold on, please," Daphne murmured through tears. "Your father needs you. He's looking for you, little one. You have to meet your baby brother who's going to be born. Please, just please, hold on." The entire hospital seemed to have stopped to watch Rose's struggle for life. The doctors worked frenetically, administering medications and trying to control the endless convulsion. Daphne felt her own world crumbling as she thought she could have prevented all of this. The heart-shaped mark on the girl's neck seemed to pulse with each spasm, constantly reminding her of her mistake. "How could I have been so blind?" she thought, watching the scene in despair. "How did I not see the truth that was right in front of me?" The minutes dragged on as the convulsion continued. Rose's body, already so fragile from pneumonia and the night in the rain, seemed to be losing the battle. Her lips were taking on a worrying bluish hue, and her breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. Daphne held her hand tightly, silently praying for a miracle. "My God, please allow me to correct the mistake I made," she murmured to herself. "This girl is a little child, please don't take her away." Suddenly, Rose's body went rigid as stone, her muscles contracting to the maximum as the convulsion reached its peak. The doctors shouted for more medication, desperately trying to save the girl's life. Daphne watched it all in a paralyzing state of horror, unable to do anything but hold Rose's increasingly cold hand. "Please, God," she begged, her tears falling onto the girl's contorted face. "Don't take her now, not like this." The tension in the emergency room was palpable as everyone fought to save Rose. The sound of the cardiac monitors mingled with the doctor's shouts and Daphne's muffled sobs. The convulsion continued, shaking the small body with frightening force. It was as if all the pain and suffering Rose had endured exploded at once, consuming her already so fragile body. "She's just a child," Daphne thought, devastated. A child who only wanted to find her father. After long minutes of anguish, the doctors finally managed to stabilize Rose. The small body lay still on the emergency stretcher, connected to various machines, her breathing still difficult, but finally regular. The fever began to subside with the intravenous medication. Daphne gently squeezed the girl's icy hand, determined to fix her mistakes. "Now your father needs to know," she whispered, rising quickly. "He has to know you're here and needs to see you, little one." The hospital corridors seemed endless as Daphne ran towards Daniel's room. Her heart pounded unevenly, still shaken by the terrible scene she had witnessed in the emergency room. As she approached the room, she heard raised voices coming from inside. She pushed the door open without ceremony, but stopped abruptly upon seeing Charles Carden sitting beside his son's bed. The family patriarch emanated his usual aura of authority and power. "Daniel, it's urgent," she blurted out, ignoring her father-in-law's intimidating presence. "The girl, the one who said she was your daughter. She's here in the emergency room." Charles's reaction was immediate. He rose from the chair in a calculated movement, his face a mask of disbelief and disdain. "What absurd story is this?" he questioned, his voice razor-sharp. "Where did this supposed daughter come from? Another scammer trying to take advantage of our family." His cold eyes studied Daphne with suspicion. "And you, believing any woman who shows up with a far-fetched story." Daniel tried to get up from the bed, his pale face in shock at his father's words. Daphne, however, took a step forward, facing her father-in-law. "She has the Carden mark," she stated firmly, "the same mark that Daniel has on his neck." Charles's eyes narrowed dangerously, observing his son's reaction to the mention of the mark. "A mark can be falsified," he countered coldly. "You're both very naive to believe this farce." A shadow of doubt crossed Charles's face when Daniel mentioned Helen to explain the situation, but it was so fleeting it could have been imagined. "That maid," he sneered, his voice laden with contempt. "Please, Daniel, don't tell me you're going to believe this ridiculous story. How many others must be out there making up stories to get money?" His face contorted into an expression of disgust. "Our family cannot stoop to that level." And with visible effort, Daniel pulled off the wires and sensors connected to his body. His legs wobbled as he touched the cold hospital floor, but determination gave him strength. "I'm going to see my daughter. She needs me." "I'm not going to waste time on this, Dad," he declared, his voice firm despite his physical weakness. Charles took a step forward, blocking his path. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his voice dangerously low. "Don't you see this is clearly a setup?" The path to the emergency room was a battle, with Daniel walking alongside Daphne, now more healed. Charles followed closely behind, his acid comments echoing through the hallway. "How can you be so naive?" he insisted. "These people have no scruples, they'll do anything for money. They probably trained the girl for this performance." When they finally reached Rose's bedside, Daniel felt his legs weaken. There, connected to so many machines, was a miniature version of Helen, the same delicate features, the same slim nose, and on her neck, unmistakable, the mark that carried his own blood. "My daughter," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Charles watched the scene with calculating eyes, his mind clearly working on ways to discredit what he saw. Rose's eyes opened slowly at the sound of her father's voice. Even through the oxygen mask, it was possible to see a small smile forming on her pale lips. With effort, she raised a trembling hand towards him. "Dad," she whispered weakly, "please, help Grandma Hazel. She needs a better hospital." Charles let out a dry, cruel laugh. "Already started asking for money," he commented venomously. Typical. With trembling hands, ignoring his father's comments, Daniel took his wife's phone and called the community hospital. With each ring of the phone, Charles made a derogatory comment about the situation, trying to plant seeds of doubt in his son's mind. The nurse finally answered, initially reluctant to give information. After a few moments of waiting that seemed an eternity, her voice returned to the line, "Mr. Carden, I need to inform you that there has been a change in the patient's condition." A tense silence took over the room as everyone awaited the news. Rose squeezed her father's hand with all the strength she could muster, her eyes wide with expectation. The nurse's voice returned, laden with surprise. "The doctors say it was a miracle. This lady wasn't going to survive. She was in a very serious situation, but some force made her body react. She woke up from the coma a few minutes ago. The doctors are evaluating, but her vital signs are stabilizing." In the corner of the room, partially hidden by the shadows, Charles watched the scene with a dangerous glint in his eyes. His face was a mask of contempt as he studied every detail of the girl on the gurney, every resemblance to Helen, every proof that could destroy. His fingers drummed lightly on his crossed arm as his calculating mind already traced plans. This won't stay like this, he thought, his cold eyes fixed on Rose. I won't let any bastard destroy everything I've built. Daniel, still attentive to the phone, spoke to the attendant in a decisive voice. I want the best available ambulance for transfer and a full medical team. My daughter's grandmother will have the best possible treatment, Daniel ordered on the phone, still sitting by Rose's bed. His voice, though weak from his own recovery, left no doubt about his authority. Ma'am, wait a moment, said Daniel to the community hospital attendant, turning then to Rose with an emotional smile. Daughter, your grandmother is fine. She woke up and is responding well to the medications, he said, causing the girl's eyes to fill with tears as a weak smile formed on her pale face. Returning to the phone, Daniel spoke in a decisive voice. I want this patient to be transferred immediately. His voice, though weak from his own recovery, left no doubt about his authority. Hazel would be immediately transferred from the community hospital to one of the best rooms in the private hospital with all the necessary facilities. It's the least I can do for the woman who took care of my daughter, he said, squeezing Rose's small hand. She's going to have the best treatment money can buy. Hazel's arrival at the private hospital happened the following morning. The ambulance, equipped with the best resources, made the transfer without any incidents. The doctors installed her in a room next to Rose, allowing grandmother and granddaughter to recover close to each other. The nurses noticed how both of their vital signs improved significantly just by being in the same environment. It's a miracle, Hazel whispered as she was accommodated. My little one made it. She saved us both. Over the days, both Rose and her father recovered completely. The girl's pneumonia yielded to intensive treatments, while Daniel, already recovered, visited the hospital daily. The doctors were surprised at the speed of both recoveries. It's impressive how the body responds when it receives proper treatment, commented the chief physician during his rounds. Soon, everyone will be able to go home. The tension reached its peak when Charles entered the hospital room that afternoon. His cold eyes scanned the environment with evident contempt, lingering on Rose, who slept peacefully. So this is the little bastard who is destroying our family? He mocked, his voice laden with venom. Look at her, Daniel. She doesn't even look like a Carden with those poor clothes, he said. Daniel felt his blood boil in his veins, but Daphne was quicker. You have no right to speak like that, she defended, placing herself between her father-in-law and the girl. Charles let out a dry, cruel laugh. Even you, Daphne. Have you already forgotten who we are? The Cardens don't mix with these people. This girl will stain our name forever. That was the last straw. Daniel grabbed his father's arm forcefully and dragged him into a private room. Enough now, he roared, trembling with rage. You know something, don't you? What did you do to Helen? What do you know about my daughter? He asked, when a smile formed on Charles's face made his stomach churn. The confession came like a punch to the gut. Helen died in childbirth, Charles revealed, his voice as cold as ice. I knew about the pregnancy from the beginning. That maid girl had the audacity to come to me asking for help. His face contorted into an expression of disgust. I paid some dangerous men to keep the girl, and if they didn't want to, get rid of the problem. But the incompetents lost the child, and she ran away when they were distracted. Daniel staggered with the impact of the words. You planned all this? He whispered, horrified. Charles continued, his voice laden with contempt. Of course I planned it. I couldn't let a bastard stain our name. The men should have taken the child away and kept her. Or gotten rid of her. I didn't care to know if she was alive or dead. I just wanted her not to stain the family name. But those fools lost her. A 6-year-old child managed to outsmart them and run away. She couldn't even speak. They didn't even talk to her. She was almost like furniture from what they told me later, so she wouldn't be a problem for our family. The rage exploded in Daniel's chest like a storm. Get out of here, he roared, advancing threateningly towards his father. You're a monster. Never come near my daughter again. You don't deserve to know your granddaughter, nor the baby Daphne is expecting. His voice echoed through the walls of the room. To me, you're dead. Charles straightened his tie with calculated movements, his face a mask of coldness. You'll regret this, he threatened, walking towards the door. Society will never accept this bastard. And when she destroys everything we've built, don't say I didn't warn you." With those words, he left, leaving only the echo of his evil in the air. Daniel remained in the room, his legs trembling with the weight of the revelations. Helen's death, his father's cruel plan, the planned abandonment of his daughter. It all spun through his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "How could I not see?" he thought, tears of rage streaming down his face. "How could I let this man control our lives for so long?" Charles stormed out of the hospital, his rage blinding him to everything around him. He didn't even notice the runaway truck coming his way as he crossed the street outside the crosswalk. The impact was instant and fatal. The Carden patriarch, who took such pride in his power and influence, died as he lived, alone and full of hate. The news reached Daniel minutes later through a nurse who witnessed the accident. Daniel felt his heart tighten with a confused mixture of emotions: pain for the loss of the father he once loved, anger at the crimes he committed, and overwhelming guilt that their last encounter had revealed such a despicable face. Silent tears streamed down his face as he thought about everything that had happened. How is it possible to feel such sadness and such relief at the same time? He whispered to himself. Days later, the Carden mansion pulsed with a different life. Rose and Hazel had been discharged from the hospital, and the once cold and austere house now echoed with laughter and lively conversation. The empty rooms were transformed into welcoming spaces, the heavy curtains replaced with light fabrics that let the sun freely stream in. The little one, fully recovered from pneumonia, explored every corner of her new home with the curiosity befitting childhood. "It's so different from anything I've ever known," she commented to Hazel, her eyes shining with delight. "But the best part is having everyone together here." In the mansion's library, Daniel organized the papers of his father's will. Charles' sudden death had left the entire Carden empire in his hands, and his first decision was to create a fund for underprivileged children in Helen's name. Daphne, who now sported a pregnant belly in the final stages of pregnancy, silently entered the office and placed a cup of tea beside him. "She would be proud of you," she said softly, referring to Helen. "You're turning the Carden name into something worth having." Among the most meaningful moments of those days was Daniel's discovery of how Ruth had helped his daughter. Upon learning that the maid had used her own savings and requested an advance to save Rose, he not only tripled her salary, but extended the benefit to all the mansion's employees. "Never again will one of my employees have to beg for medical care," he declared, implementing a comprehensive health plan for all employees and their families. Ruth, emotional at the recognition, found in Rose not only the girl she had saved, but a true friend. The two spent hours conversing in the garden, sharing stories and laughter while tending to the roses they had planted together. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to gain an entire family," Ruth would say, watching as the once cold and distant mansion now overflowed with life and joy. The mansion's garden, once meticulously pruned into rigid, lifeless shapes, now housed a small flower bed that Rose had planted with Hazel's help. Daisies, roses, and sunflowers grew free and colorful, just like the joy that now inhabited that space. Daniel watched his daughter and Hazel tending to the plants, their hearts finally at peace after so much suffering. "This is how it should have been from the start," he murmured to himself. "A family united by love, not separated by prejudice." The weeks that followed brought a peace that none of them had ever known. Daphne, now in her final month of pregnancy, spent her afternoons on the mansion's porch, watching Rose play in the garden she had helped create. The girl seemed to blossom along with her plants, her smile lighting up every corner of the house that had once felt so cold. "You brought life to this place," Daphne commented, caressing her belly as she watched her stepdaughter. "I never thought this mansion could be so full of joy." Hazel, fully recovered, naturally assumed the role of family matriarch. Her simple wisdom and unconditional love filled the spaces once occupied by fear and prejudice. Her homemade recipes now perfumed the mansion's kitchen, and her stories filled the nights with magic and laughter. "Life has a funny way of fixing things," she would always say whenever someone commented on the changes. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters." Daniel had completely transformed the family business. The Carden Empire, once known only for its economic power, now stood out for its social projects. The fund created in Helen's name had already helped dozens of underprivileged children, and plans for an even larger foundation were underway. "This is how I will honor her memory," he thought, looking at Helen's portrait that now occupied a prominent place in his office. "By turning the wrong they did to you into good for others." It was on a particularly hot afternoon that Daphne felt the first contractions. The movement in the mansion was immediate, Hazel organizing everything with the calm of one who had experienced many births, Rose running back and forth trying to help, and Daniel, nervous like any first-time father. "It's a boy," the doctor announced hours later, handing the small bundle to the proud parents. "And he has the mark," Daphne whispered emotionally, noticing the small heart on the baby's neck. Rose approached the hospital bed with hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the tiny brother sleeping in Daphne's arms. The baby, as if sensing her presence, opened his eyes and grasped her finger with surprising strength. "He's so small," she murmured, enchanted, "and he has the same mark as me and Daddy." Daniel hugged his daughter from behind, his eyes brimming with emotion. "It's because we're a family," he said softly. "A real family." Hazel watched the scene from the corner of the room, her heart overflowing with happiness. That girl she had found on a rainy night had brought more blessings than she could ever imagine. God writes straight with crooked lines, she thought, wiping away a discreet tear. And sometimes he uses a child to teach adults the true meaning of love. The little one brought with him a new wave of joy to the mansion. His crying echoed through the hallways like a music no one ever tired of hearing, and his smiles were like sun rays on already bright days. Rose proved to be a devoted older sister, always ready to help with the baby's care. "Now he'll never feel alone," she said one night, helping Daphne rock her brother. "He'll always have someone to protect him." The transformation of Carden Mansion was complete. What was once a symbol of power and prejudice was now a true home where love and acceptance reigned supreme. Rose's laughter and the baby's cries mingled with Hazel's stories and Daphne's lullabies, creating a symphony of happiness that seemed to have no end. "Look, Helen," Daniel whispered to the starry sky. "Our daughter did it. She turned hatred into love, sadness into joy. She saved us all." 6 months had passed since those turbulent days. Carden Mansion, once known for its imposing architecture and rigid gardens, was now famous in the neighborhood for the sound of laughter echoing through its hallways. The baby, with his first little teeth showing, crawled over the rugs chasing his older sister, who always pretended not to be able to catch him, making him laugh with joy. Hazel, fully recovered, turned the former formal dining room into a cozy space where the family actually gathered. Meals were now moments of sharing not only food, but also stories and dreams. Her homemade recipes blended with the sophisticated dishes the chefs prepared, creating a unique menu that symbolized the union of two once distant worlds. Daphne surprised everyone with her dedication to her 2 children, the biological one and her daughter of the heart. Motherhood had softened her once stern features, and it was common to find her sitting on the children's room floor, playing with the baby while listening intently to the stories Rose read to her brother. The love that grew between them knew no barriers of blood or origin. Daniel completely transformed the Carden legacy. The company, once focused solely on profits, now maintained one of the largest foundations supporting underprivileged children in the country. The Helen Fund, as it was called, had already built 3 hospitals in deprived areas and maintained scholarship programs for low-income youth. "This is how we honor her memory," he would always say when inaugurating a new project. Rose's story spread throughout the city, inspiring other families to revisit their prejudices and values. The girl who was once rejected in the rain was now an example of how love can tear down the most solid barriers. Her exemplary grades at school and her talent for music, discovered during the piano lessons she had so desired, were a source of pride for the entire family. Charles's former office was transformed into a community library, where Rose and Hazel spent entire afternoons reading to neighborhood children. The shelves, once filled with accounting books, now housed fairy tales and adventure stories. On the main wall, a portrait of Helen smiled at all who entered, as if approving the transformation of that once somber space. One afternoon, while watching his family gathered in the garden, Rose pushing her little brother on the swing, Daphne and Hazel chatting in the shade of a tree, Ruth serving fresh lemonade to everyone, Daniel felt a peace he had never known before. The empire his father had fought so hard to keep intact had not been destroyed as Charles feared. It had been transformed into something much greater and more meaningful. The true wealth of the Cardins was no longer in their bank accounts, but in the love that united that unlikely and special family. After all the challenges, Rose found not only a father, but an entire family that finally understood the value of unconditional love. Each difficulty faced brought those around her together in an unimaginable way. Daniel's transformation, from a distant man to a loving and protective father, symbolized a rebirth not only for him, but for the entire Cardin legacy. He realized that the wealth and power he possessed meant nothing without a real family, one he could protect and honor, and decided to rebuild that legacy around love and support for others. Rose, in turn, blossomed. She was no longer the lost wandering girl. Her courage in insisting on her truth proved that her strength came from something much greater than the mere search for a home. Her presence transformed the lives of all around her, inspiring them to embrace second chances. The Cardin mansion became a true home, a place where the echoes of laughter filled the corridors that once held only silence and secrets. Daphne, in embracing Rose as a daughter, found the profound meaning of motherhood, understanding that a mother's love goes beyond blood ties. Hazel, with her faith and affection, became the center of that home, healing not only Rose's soul but also those of all who lived there. And Ruth, with her act of kindness in saving Rose's life, personified the redemption that money cannot buy. As for the baby, he was the symbol that a united family was life's greatest gift. Now every corner of that house carried the marks of the love that was built brick by brick, in a home full of hope and purpose. Rose's story showed that pain and loss need not define one's destiny. From suffering, she built a new life, a life where the true legacy of the Cardins would forever be the transformative power of love and compassion. If you liked this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.